I would like to try to do here. All right. I would like to direct your attention. We'll go ahead and get the title up there. I'd like to direct your attention to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. I want to read just a little bit here before I get into the lesson specifically. And I want to read a few verses from 1 Corinthians chapter 1. You know, it ties to the things that Brant shared at the table and the prayer that Brother Jeff led. In today's time, the seeking after wisdom is, it's important, but where it comes from. I was in a conversation earlier in the week, or I guess late last week, and someone said, you know, we just don't know. We don't know all that Jesus said. We don't know all that was written. How could he have relayed everything that we need to know in just 33 years? And all of us know that it began much before Jesus Christ arrived. And it continues still to this day for us to know him through the Word. We can't know everything, but we can know enough to have faith. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul was here trying to cleanse the church in Corinth because they had confused earthly wisdom with heavenly wisdom, with what comes from above. And so I read to you beginning in verse 18 of 1 Corinthians chapter 1 by the Apostle Paul, reading from the New King James Version. We read, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise and bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent. Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through wisdom did not know God, it pleased God through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. For Jews request a sign and Greeks seek after wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, to the Jews a stumbling block, and to the Greeks foolishness. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God, because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. For you see your calling, brethren, that not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to put to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to put to shame the things which are mighty." I won't continue there, but you could continue to read that as Paul relays to those in Corinth how God's wisdom is greater than ours. How even at our highest, we haven't reached the folly of the Creator. And so this morning here, I want to share with you just a little bit about wisdom from above. I've wanted to share this. I first came across this in January, and our speaking times don't come about as often as some of us would like, but we're patient and we prepare this to share with you today. James chapter 3, verse 17 from James chapter 3, it is written, "But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy." So James is going to talk about the wisdom that is from above. Before we get into this, I wanted to share that it is following Solomon's lead. You know, you can't hardly think about wisdom and someone who is wise without your mind being drawn back to the Old Testament, to Solomon. And I didn't record it. I didn't even look it up as I was preparing this. But if you remember, Solomon, as David's son, asked for wisdom and understanding from God. And if you recall, God said, because you didn't ask for riches, I will not only bless you with wisdom, but I will bless you with riches. And if you go back and you look at the early years of Solomon's kingdom, of his role as king, it was tremendous. You know, I've gone blank. The queen, I think maybe the queen of Ethiopia came can't remember exactly which country she came from. It's not really relevant. She came to seek his knowledge. And the scriptures record that he shared more than she could comprehend. And so indeed, if we will follow Solomon's lead, as we have listed here, we will do well. And I must confess, Ethan, I don't think I've got all of my slides so that the subtitles are below. If you might help me. Ethan does a great job with that, and I'm sorry that I didn't do that before. Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 13, Solomon writes, "Happy is the man who finds wisdom, and the man who gains understanding. Happy is he." Proverbs 4 and verse 7, "Wisdom is the principal thing, therefore get wisdom." And then the Apostle Paul in Ephesians 5 verses 15 through 17 gives us a New Testament connection to that as well. "See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time because the days are evil. Therefore do not be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is." All three of these things encourage us to seek wisdom, but where do we find that? Before I switch to the next slide, there was a man that taught structural engineering at the University of Arkansas when I was there. He was a really fascinating person. He had 4 degrees, if I remember right, one of which was in theology, and he was serving as a missionary in Africa during a time of their civil war and was actually a prisoner of war. If those of you who are old enough to remember late 80s and 90s sitcoms, there was one that Tim Allen was the star of called Home Improvement. And the man that lived over the back fence from Tim was a man they called Wilson. And generally you could only see his eyes. You couldn't tell any other features from him. But he would always have some wisdom that he was imparting in that television show. How do I tie all this together? That man Wilson was a lot like the Dr. Plyman that I learned under from structural engineering. And he would begin most semesters by quoting Sir Isaac Newton. "As the circle of my knowledge grows, so grows the circumference of the unknown." Garrett and I were talking the other day, and he was saying, the more I learn, the more I feel like I don't know. And I relayed that very fact. The more we learn, so grows the circumference of what we don't know. And we can never know everything, but we don't have to. Even Einstein made the statement, "I don't know everything, but I know where to find it." And as long as we have control of the scriptures, and as we let them be our guide, we truly can know all that we need to know to live in accordance with God's word. In James chapter 3, we're going to read about wisdom from above. Let's read these few verses. James chapter 3, beginning in verse 13. He says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. This wisdom does not descend from above, but is earthly, sensual, demonic. For where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing will be there. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. Now the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace." So what is wisdom? What we're going to talk about this morning are the two kinds, earthly and heavenly wisdom. We're going to see the origin. We'll talk about the nature of both types, and we will also look at the fruits of both types, all stemming from this passage, James chapter 3, verses 13 through 17. Earthly wisdom, we read it to begin with, is worldly. I believe when Paul was talking to Festus tried to prove that Paul didn't really understand what he was talking about when he was talking about Christ and the kingdom. And remember, Festus said to Paul, "Much learning has made you mad." Well, in this recent conversation, as a young man was trying to explain to me that we cannot know enough about Jesus to actually follow him. Oh, what folly. That's what the world would say. You can't know enough to actually follow him. That's not the case. Earthly wisdom is indeed worldly. It is sensual, according to verse 15. And by that, what does that mean? It's not meant to be anything more than it applies to the senses. What I can see, smell, taste, touch, hear. It applies to the senses, this earthly wisdom does. And we are drawn away by our desires to leave heavenly wisdom and to seek after earthly wisdom. It is demonic. It proceeds from or resembles that comes from demons, from the devil. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. What about the origin of heavenly wisdom? According to James chapter 1 and verse 17, if you flip over, if you have your New Testaments, verse 17 says, "Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning." You know, we've heard that. I've heard that most of my life, that passage quoted. Sometimes I quote it in prayers, and that's where I have heard it most of the times. "In whom there is no variation or shadow of turning." We can take great comfort in realizing this, that every good gift that we need comes from above. And so this heavenly wisdom is sent from God. How? Look at James chapter 1. We'll read verses 5 through 8, where he says, if any lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith, with no doubting. For he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. We ask in faith, and he generously provides. And so we request this wisdom through him, according to our faith. And so I will submit to you that today, if there's wisdom that you seek, first seek to humiliate yourself, to be humble, to be lowly in God's eyes, and then seek that wisdom that comes from him. And Paul said that he gives liberally and without reproach. James in verse 5. Well, what about the nature of wisdom? What is the nature of earthly wisdom? If you look at the text in verses 14 and 16, you'll see that it is concerned with the 4 P's: power, position, privilege, and prestige. We might grab our lapels and we might say, "Oh, look at me. Look what I have. Look what I've accomplished. Look what I've done. Look at what I've laid up." And that is the opposite of heavenly wisdom. That is earthly, concerned with all I can get. You know, as I think about this, there is a line in a movie. I can't even tell you which movie. But there was a guy who wasn't so good. And if I remember right, there was one who was talking with this man about doing the right thing, and he was more about seeking revenge. And this man said, "Oh, I'll get mine. Don't you worry. I'll get mine." I think that's the mindset of the world today. "Oh, I'll get mine. You do what you need to, but I'll get mine." It's concerned with the 4 P's. It prompted Satan's rebellion. Satan believed that he was higher than God, and because of that, he rebelled, and he now rules purgatory forever. It also prompted the apostles to argue about who's greater. You know, that's something that we are challenged with today, isn't it? Who's greater? Who's greater? Am I? Are you? Does it really matter? Not at all. The scriptures record, by the way, that he who serves is greatest. Jesus proved that principle right when he washed the apostles' feet. Well, what about the nature of heavenly wisdom? And this is where we'll spend the majority of our time. Whether or not we'll read each of these verses, I'm not sure, but I have several things that I'd like to share. This is the list. If you're seeking wisdom, if you want it to resonate in your life and you want it to be visible, this is the list. Heavenly wisdom is first pure, true to God's will. Pure also means not contaminated, separated from sin, consecrated to God. You know, you think about contamination. It's kind of an ugly kind of an ugly thing to consider. I'll share a lighthearted one with you to think about contamination. And this is nothing new. For those who have been around me know for sure. Since our girls were little, I learned a little bit about what contamination was when our oldest daughter was little. She asked for a drink. Dad, can I have a drink? And I shared my drink. And little did I know that that little mouth wasn't empty when she took a drink from my glass. And after which my glass was contaminated. We witnessed it over the last few weeks as our granddaughters were here. And as you would think, a cup that can't spill when you turn it upside down, that somehow that would prevent that. But yet you could hold up one of their little cups and you could see things inside that. That's contamination. And I'd like to think that in a completely transparent world, if our lives are to be like a glass that you can see through, you can also see the contamination of sin that is in our lives. And so it is pure. Heavenly wisdom is pure, trusts God's will, is true to His will, is consecrated, devoted to Him. It is peaceable. It holds to God's truths. Peaceable is the fruit of righteousness. And we'll talk about this later. It is mentioned in verse 18, that the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace. And that means we have the seeds within us of peace. We have the seeds of righteousness. And we sow those. We're peaceable. Romans 12 and verse 18, if I remember right, says that it is encouraged of all of us to live peaceably with all mankind. You know, what I've learned is how I can live peaceably with most people. That's a challenge for me. Those who are close to me will echo this statement. Is to be quiet. You want to be at peace with most people? Listen. Talk less. You can be at peace with most people if you do that. Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 11 is a verse that I have written. It says, "Now no chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but grievous. Nevertheless, afterward it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it." When we think about the wisdom that is from above and it being peaceable, it's also because there is a chastening that goes with that. And that is to learn how to be peaceable. And I think it's important that it is a learned trait oftentimes. He says also that it is gentle, and that is in association with meekness. 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 24. 2 Timothy chapter 2 verse 24 says, "And a servant of the Lord must not quarrel, but be gentle to all, able to teach, patient." Must not quarrel, must be gentle. You know, when I think about gentleness, I also think about someone who has the knowledge, but who gently shares it. Doesn't make you feel bad. Another conversation that I had over the last few days was someone who was contemplating joining the worship service to be a part of the assembly. And he said, "You know where I've been in the past? Those churches make me feel like an outsider." Nobody wants to feel like an outsider. Everybody wants to be received. And I think there is a gentle nature that we as Christians should have that implores all to come, that we might be gentle. This word comes from two Greek words, unto and likely. And it means seemly, fitting, equitable, fair. And the last one is forbearing. I like that one. Forbearing. It means I know this may be a difficult time. Our exchange may be difficult. But I'm going to forbear through this. And I'm going to be gentle with you in that moment. It says also willing to yield. Not willing to yield in the truth, but willing to yield when it comes to liberties. And I've got Romans chapter 14, verse 1 and verses 19 through 21. You might read those. Those are where we find liberties. And that's where we realize not only in liberties, but in most things in this life, you don't have to share everything that you know. You don't have to say what you think all the time. In fact, it's probably best that you don't. If somebody really wants to know what you think, they'll ask you what you think. And so we can be willing to yield. The term is entreat, and it means ready to obey or to be compliant. The next one is full of mercy, and that is quick to forgive. In James chapter 2 and verse 13, for judgment is without mercy to the one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. We are to be full of, and the Greek word for full means to measure. So seriously, to measure. You don't just say, I'm full of mercy or he's full of mercy. It is the idea of understanding a quantity of mercy that has been given. And indeed, that is the case. And mercy is that which is provided by God. And we could go into a complete study on that, and I don't want to spend the time to do that this morning. But the idea is that we would be quick to forgive. And that is where heavenly wisdom resides, is in that ability to forgive. It is also full of good fruits. The Greek word for good is beneficial, morally honorable, pleasing to God. So it's good. We might say somebody's a good person. Well, I think oftentimes, and that's why I go through these definitions, because sometimes we have in our own minds what we think good is. God good's, it's good. It's good. Well, I think about salsa. You can say salsa's good, but I get really nervous when someone says, oh no, this salsa's good, you got to try it. I don't like spicy, and I don't like hot. I don't like it at all. And so for me, if someone says, hey, this is really good salsa, you need to try it. Well, I need to know a little bit more. A good person. Well, what do you mean good? They're good because they were good to you, or they're good because they're good in general? If it's beneficial, if it's morally honorable, if it's pleasing to God, that's what good is considered according to W.E. Vine. And fruit, full of good fruits, visible expression of power working inwardly. Think about Galatians chapter 5 and verse 22. The fruits of the Spirit, if you have those, love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, kindness, and they continue. Those are the outward expressions of what you know is happening inside. And if those things aren't visible outside, then you know they're not happening inside. And so full of good fruits, full of the expression that is working inside. In James chapter 1 and verse 22, but be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. And then in chapter 2 and verse 26, where he says, for as the body without the Spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also. So we're encouraged to be a doer, to produce that fruit that others can see. Heavenly wisdom is without partiality. It is no respecter of persons. And I'm not going to read this passage, but I have it listed there. In James chapter 2 and verse 1, I'll paraphrase. If someone comes in and they're not dressed the way that you and I might be dressed, and I don't even mean that they might be dressed as the least of these. I mean if they might come in tattered clothes. Maybe they've worked this morning. Maybe they don't present themselves the way you might expect. And you say, oh, you can sit back there. But someone comes in and maybe they have their suit on. Maybe they are like me, they have a tie and a coat on. And you might hold them higher. That's not the reason that I wear a coat and tie, by the way. But someone comes in and they're well dressed. And we might say, oh, here, take this seat. This is a good seat. Take this one. That's treating people with partiality, and that's not the way. Some of you will remember, I know Brother Kevin McKinney does, and he and I talk about this often. Shortly after this building was opened, we had a guest. Many of you will remember, a couple of you were standing with me at the back, and as you could see through the glass doors, this visitor approached. And I'm ashamed still to this day of the way I viewed this young man. He did not come dressed for worship. He came with what he had on, which was a pair of gym shorts, a ragged t-shirt, and a pair of cowboy boots. And he stepped inside and he was as humble as he could be. And he wanted to talk to the leaders. You know what that young man wanted? Do you remember? He wanted to pray with us that this work might be successful. I once again learned my place. We don't judge the book by its cover. It's not what we wear that make us who we are. We do not show partiality. We are no respecter of persons. But that is indeed a challenge that we have. And finally, heavenly wisdom is without hypocrisy. It is sincere. Dissimulation is the Greek word that you might look up that comes from this passage. It is unfeigned. It means not an act. It means not an act. I will say it again, it means not an act. Hypocrisy used to be when they would put on the masks and they would present things and it would be an act. You know, today in our time, we can get through just about anything, can't we? As our oldest daughter, was headed home, she was not looking forward to that flight back to California with those two daughters of hers. She thought she was going to have her husband here with her to make that trip home. And so they set the time of the flight at 8 p.m. Friday night. And she dreaded being by herself. She dreaded most of Friday, this trip. But as we dropped her off at the airport, she said, you know, it'll just be a few hours. It'll just be a few hours and we can get through this. I think we think about things a lot like that in this life. You know, I can get through this. It's just a few hours. But where we have to be careful is when we put on this mask that is not who I really am, and it becomes an act. It's not sincere. That's hypocrisy. If I tell you how you should do, but I don't live how I should do, that's hypocrisy. And heavenly wisdom is without hypocrisy. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 6, for those of you who are taking notes, 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 6, and 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 22, 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 22, as well as Romans chapter 12 and verse 9, we see that as it relates to love, how love is shared. Love does not have anything to do with hypocrisy as well. And that's visible in those passages. So what about the fruits? Well, what are the fruits of earthly wisdom? Verse 16 says it's confusion in every evil thing. Now that doesn't mean that every time you see every evil thing in earthly wisdom. It just means that there's confusion. And I have to admit that one time I worked with a young engineer, and I think I've shared this as well. I like to debate things when it comes to engineering. I like to work with my staff, to collaborate, to ask the questions, to maybe we all get to the same place. And this young believer, super conscientious young man, he asked me, he'd never been in the consulting industry, and he asked me, he said, Hollis, quietly, just the two of us, he said, do you try to confuse me? And I failed again. I said, no, David, I don't try to confuse you. I'm just trying to talk through this that we might see both sides. Earthly wisdom is confusing. One who has earthly wisdom, and this was written by Guy Woods when you read his commentary. At the end of this passage, he shares one who has earthly wisdom lets people know that he's wise. He boasts of his wisdom. He boasts of what he has. Heavenly wisdom is peace and righteousness. Those are the fruits that come from heavenly wisdom. Are people at peace with you? When they're with you, are they at peace? Do you help them? One who has heavenly wisdom is meek, and it is shown in good conduct. So, let's look at the summary. If we could see the earthly on the left and the heavenly on the right, you see the origin of earthly wisdom is from the world, yet the origin from heavenly wisdom is from God by request. We ask and He gives, according to James chapter 1. The nature of earthly wisdom is self-seeking. Remember the 4 P's: power, prestige, principle, and position. We look for those things from others. The nature of heavenly wisdom are the Christian attributes. And there's so many: pure, peaceable, gentle, willing to yield. The things that we've talked about, the things that we've spent our time on this morning. And what about the fruits of earthly wisdom? Well, confusion. And James said every evil thing, anything that's evil, could come from earthly wisdom. But what are the fruits of heavenly wisdom? It's peace and righteousness. And so as I was trying to wrap this up, the conclusion that I found was an interesting list that comes from the Thompson Chain Reference Bible. They have it summarized as true wisdom. What is true wisdom? And these are the things that it records. It cannot exist without the fear of God. Job 28 and verse 28. It can be learned, according to Job 32 and verse 7, as well as Psalm 111 and verse 10. It is the supreme acquisition, as we read when we opened the thoughts this morning from Proverbs 4 and verse 7. It comprehends divine truth, according to Hosea chapter 14 and verse 9. It lays an immovable foundation, according to Matthew chapter 7 and verse 24, the wise builder, as well as 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 6. Scripture is the source of heavenly wisdom, 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 15, and it is full of spiritual fruits, which we've studied this morning, James chapter 3 and verse 17. Get wisdom, and get it from the right place. Seek it through the Scriptures, and you will not be left without. We never want to close without extending the invitation. I appreciate your patience this morning as we've walked through these things. We've not talked that much about our spiritual lives. But if you're here this morning, and I'll just meddle for just a minute. If you're here this morning and you don't think your life is right with God, there's a good chance that your life is not right with God. We never want to close without extending the invitation. This is not the only time that you can seek doing the right thing. You can do that at any time, asking any one of us, and we'd be willing to help you. If you're here this morning and you've never obeyed the gospel, you hear the word as we have shared it this morning, to believe that Jesus is the Son of God, to repent of your past life, which means to turn in a direction that is toward Jesus, to confess that He is the Son of God, and then to be baptized, having your sins washed away. The water is ready. We could take care of that this morning. If you're here this morning and you've taken those steps, but you realize that maybe you've not used the proper wisdom that you should have. We're all human. None of us go without faults. But if we can help you this morning, repent of those wrongs, confess them, and we can pray with you and for you. If there's one of either case, please come while we stand.